based on a few drops of blood from a fingerprint was basically a mirage. Holmes had convinced Walgreens and Safeway to buy into our idea, and what a mistake that was. Millions of Theranos lab results had to be voided after John exposed the scam. John's reporting has had lasting consequences. Holmes has been barred from running a lab and recently agreed to a settlement with the SEC, in which he's also barred from being the director of a public company. Moreover, Theranos recently laid off the majority of its staff and is expected to go bankrupt within months. Let me tell you a little bit about John. He graduated from Duke in 1994, and let's not hold that against him. He joined Dow Jones after graduation and in 1999 two Pulitzer Prizes, the 2003 Explanatory Reporting Prize for Corporate Scandals and the 2015 Investigative Prize for the great series Medicare Unmasked, which helped open up Medicare data for reporters, something I know I'm grateful for and I think a lot of people in this room are as well. John's work on Theranos did not earn him a third Pulitzer Prize, but it did earn him AHCJ's award for beat reporting, which was awarded in 2016, the award that really matters. Back to Theranos. John's work is so important for the public and for health reporters. It's a cautionary tale about believing the hype. It is a lesson in source building and being skeptical and questioning. It's a lesson in staying firm even when a company comes at you hard. And Theranos came at John hard. I've been reading John's book, and it's really good. The opening example describes a scene in 2006 when the company's first chief financial officer learned that Theranos had deceived officials at the drug maker Novartis during a pitch meeting in Switzerland. The device they were developing was unreliable. Theranos used a recording of a blood reading and passed it off as real during the demonstration. When the chief financial officer complained, he was fired. Those are the types of anecdotes you can find in the book. It's amazing. It's no wonder Bad Blood is going to be made into a movie with Jennifer Lawrence playing Holmes. Days ago, John was told about an anecdote, too late to include in his book. At a company party, hang on one second because I have to be ready on this. Okay, so at a company party, Theranos employees played a video game modeled after Atari's Space Invaders. The gun was a Theranos mini lab, which was their lab equipment they were developing. The bullets were nanotainers, which is how they collected the blood. And one of the invaders being shot at was John. The inventor even sent him a screenshot. Space Invaders Theranos edition. So without further ado, John Carreyrou.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be invited to speak at this luncheon. Congratulations to all the award winners. It sounds like that was great work, though I wish we could have seen the headlines and more context for the stories. So the last time I came to Arizona, it's pretty uncanny, was 3 years ago, almost to the day. I came looking for doctors and patients who had ordered blood tests from a ballyhooed $9 billion Silicon Valley startup called Theranos. I'd gotten a tip 2 months earlier that had led me to reach out to former employees of the company. Based on what these former employees had told me, I had reason to believe that some of Theranos' blood tests were faulty and might be putting patients at risk. One of my former employee sources had given me the name of a nurse practitioner who had called and emailed Theranos on several occasions to complain about the company's test results. The nurse's name was Carmen Washington, and I had reached her by phone from New York. She had told me 3 of her patients had received questionable results from the company. One was a 16-year-old girl who had a sky-high potassium result that suggested she was at risk of a heart attack. result hadn't made sense given that she was a teenager and in good health, Carmen said. 2 other patients had received results showing abnormally high levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. Carmen had called them back into the clinic where she worked and redrawn their blood. The second time, their results had come back abnormally low. After that, Carmen had lost faith in Theranos' fingerstick tests. But Carmen had since stopped working at the clinic, which was located at the corner of Osborne Road and Central Avenue in Phoenix, if any of you know the area. And she didn't have the names of the 3 patients she'd told me about. I had another lead, though, after scanning Yelp to see if anyone had complained about a bad experience with Theranos. Sure enough, a woman who appeared to be a doctor and went by Natalie M. had. Yelp has a feature that allows you to send messages to reviewers, so I sent her a note with my contact information. She called me the next day. Natalie M's real name was Nicole Sundin. She was a family practitioner in the Phoenix suburb of Fountain Hills, and she was very unhappy with Theranos. The previous fall, she had sent one of her patients to the emergency room because of a frightening lab report from the company, only to find out that it was a false alarm. So I flew to Phoenix to meet Dr. Sundin and her patient. While here, I also plan to drop in unannounced on other physician practices that use Theranos for their lab tests. I'd gotten the names of a half dozen from an industry source. Dr. Sundin's patient, Maureen Gluntz, agreed to meet at a Starbucks near her home. She was a petite woman in her mid-50s, and she was Exhibit A for one of the 2 scenarios that are frightening if lab results aren't accurate. The lab report she'd received from Theranos had shown abnormally elevated results for calcium, protein, glucose, and 3 liver enzymes. Since she had complained of ringing in her ear, which was later determined to be caused simply by lack of sleep, Dr. Sundin had worried she might be on the cusp of a stroke and sent her straight to the hospital. Gluntz had spent 4 hours in the emergency room on the eve of Thanksgiving, while doctors ran a battery of tests on her, including a CT scan. She'd been discharged after a new set of blood tests performed by the hospital's lab came back normal. That hadn't been the end of it, however. As a precaution, she'd undergone 2 MRIs during the ensuing week. She said she'd finally stopped worrying when those had come back normal too. Gluntz's case was compelling because it showed both the emotional and the financial toll of a healthcare scare brought on by inaccurate results. As an independent real estate broker in this area, she was self-insured and had a health plan with a high deductible. The ER visit and subsequent MRIs had cost $3,000, the sum she'd had to pay out of her own pocket. While I met with Dr. Sundin at her office, I learned that Gluntz wasn't the only patient whose results she'd found suspect. She told me more than a dozen of her patients had tested suspiciously high for potassium and calcium, and she doubted the accuracy of those results as well. She had written Theranos a letter to complain, but the company hadn't even acknowledged it. With Dr. Sundin's help, I decided to conduct a little experiment. She wrote me a lab order, and I took it to the Walgreens closest to my hotel the next morning, making sure to fast to ensure the most accurate readings. The Theranos Wellness Center inside the Walgreens wasn't much to behold. It was a little room, not much bigger than a closet, with a chair and little bottles of water. Unlike Safeway, which Theranos had courted and had an aborted partnership with, Walgreens hadn't spent a fortune remodeling its stores to create upscale clinics. I sat down and waited for a few minutes while the phlebotomist entered my order into a computer and talked to someone on the phone. After she hung up, she asked me to lift up my shirt sleeve and wrapped a tourniquet around my arm. "Why no finger stick?" I asked. She replied that some of the tests in my order required a venous draw. I wasn't entirely surprised. My first and biggest, most important confidential source had explained to me, a former Theranos employee, had explained to me that of the more than 240 tests Theranos offered on its menu, only about 80 were performed on small finger stick samples. And he'd explained that a dozen of those 80 were performed on this Edison machine, which was the actual proprietary Theranos instrument, and that the other 60 or 70 among those 80 were performed on hacked Siemens machines. The rest, he'd explained to me, required what Holmes had likened in media interviews to a medieval torture mechanism, the dreaded hypodermic needle. I now had my confirmation of that. After walking out of the Walgreens, I drove my rental car to a nearby LabCorp site and submitted to another blood draw. Dr. Sundin promised to send me both sets of results when they arrived. Come to think of it, she would get herself tested at both places too, to broaden our comparative sample, she said. I spent the next few days knocking on the doors of other doctors' offices in the area. At a practice in Scottsdale, I talked to doctors Adrian Stewart, Lauren Beardsley, and Saman Razai. Dr. Stewart described a patient of hers who had postponed a long-planned trip to Ireland at the last minute because of a test result from Theranos, suggesting she might have deep vein thrombosis, a condition that occurs, as you know, when a blood clot forms, usually in the legs. People with DVT aren't supposed to fly because of the risk the clot will break loose, travel through the bloodstream, and lodge in the lungs, causing a pulmonary embolism. Dr. Stewart had subsequently set aside the Theranos result when ultrasounds of the patient's legs and a second set of blood test results from another lab had been normal. The incident had made her leery when Theranos sent her a lab report for another one of her patients showing an abnormally high TSH value. The patient was already on thyroid medication, and the results suggested that her dose needed to be raised. Before she did anything, Dr. Stewart sent the patient to get retested at Sonora Quest, a joint venture of Quest and the hospital system Banner Health. The Sonora Quest result came back normal. Had she trusted the Theranos result and increased the patient's medication dosage, the outcome could have been disastrous, Dr. Stewart said. The patient was pregnant. Increasing her dosage would have made her levels of thyroid hormone too high and put her pregnancy at risk. I also met Dr. Betts, a family practitioner in another part of the Phoenix area, who had stopped sending his patients to Theranos after a bad experience involving one of them the previous summer. That patient, also a woman, was on medication to reduce her blood pressure. One of the medicine's potential side effects was high potassium, so Dr. Betts monitored her blood regularly. After Theranos reported a near-critical potassium value for the patient, a nurse in his office sent her back there to get tested again to make sure the result was correct. But during the second visit, the phlebotomist made 3 unsuccessful attempts to draw her blood and then sent her home. Dr. Betts was furious when he found out the next day. If the original result was correct, it was imperative that he get confirmation of it as soon as possible so he could make changes to her treatment. He sent the patient to get retested at Sonora Quest. As it turned out, it was another false alarm. The potassium value Sonora Quest reported that evening was much lower than the Theranos result and well within the normal range. Dr. Betts told me the episode had shattered his trust in Theranos. A few days later, I was back at my desk at the Wall Street Journal in Midtown Manhattan when a mailroom employee handed me a thick envelope. It was from Dr. Sundin. Inside were both of our lab reports from Theranos and LabCorp. As I scanned my results, I noticed a number of discrepancies. Theranos had flagged 3 of my values as abnormally high and 1 as abnormally low. Yet on LabCorp's report, all 4 of those values showed up as normal. Meanwhile, LabCorp had flagged both my total cholesterol and my LDL cholesterol, otherwise known as bad cholesterol, as high, while the Theranos report described the first as, quote, desirable, and the second, quote, as near optimal. Those differences were mild compared to a whopper Dr. Sundin had found in her results. According to Theranos, the amount of cortisol in her blood was less than 1 microgram per deciliter. A value that low was usually associated with Addison's disease, a dangerous condition characterized by extreme fatigue and low blood pressure that could result in death if it went untreated. Her lab report, however, showed a cortisol level of 18.8 micrograms per deciliter, which was within the normal range for healthy patients. Dr. Sundin had no doubt which of the two values was the correct one. If you read my book when it comes out, you'll see that it took me 6 more months after my Phoenix trip to expose what was essentially a giant unauthorized medical experiment. The resistance the company and its lawyers put up was like nothing I'd ever experienced in 20 plus years of reporting. But in the end, the truth came out and Theranos voided or corrected nearly 1 million blood test results in California and Arizona. And there are some who believe that all 7+ million of the blood tests the company returned to patients should have been declared unreliable. The collateral damage from these false blood tests is hard to assess. Some patients have sued Theranos in federal court in Arizona, alleging medical battery and consumer fraud. One of them alleges that the company's test failed to diagnose his heart disease and led him to have a preventable heart attack. One thing is certain: the chances that people would have died from misdiagnoses or wrong medical treatments would have risen exponentially if Theranos had expanded its blood testing services to Walgreens' 8,134 other US stores, as it was on the cusp of doing when I started digging into the company in February 2015. Why am I telling you this? Well, first of all, it's to plug my book, which is coming out May 21st. It's called Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. But more importantly, to drive the point that the work that you all do as journalists who cover healthcare and medicine is important. I often describe covering healthcare in America as covering the intersection of greed and life and death. This is one of the only healthcare systems in the world that's governed by market forces. That results in a lot of abuses because there's a lot of money to be made. There are some people and companies out there who are unethical and who will do anything to make a buck, including jeopardizing people's health. You are the watchdogs who can prevent that. And many of you have already done so in big and small ways with your stories over the years, and including in these series of stories that you've won awards for today. And so I'll leave you with these parting words. American society is lucky to have you.